If I could get someone to flip the switch there by the door, please, so the doors will close. Mr. Kreidler, you didn't get the door shut quite in time. Someone snuck in at the very last moment. As far as the start of today, we always start with a request for bill introductions. I do have a request that came to me, so I will request a committee bill introduction. It is 24 RS 2212, and what this legislation does, it would require Senate confirmation of Wildlife and Parks Commission members. Without objection, that will be introduced. Is there objection? Seeing none, we will ask for committee bill introduction. Are there other bill introductions from committee members? I hadn't heard from anyone on any bill introductions necessary. So we will continue with our agenda. Before we get into our agenda, we have a group with us this morning, committee. And so I will just recognize Mr. Randy Stuckey with Renew Kansas to make some brief introductions before we actually get into the committee agenda.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much for this time this morning. Randy Stuckey, Renew Kansas Biofuels Association, and today is our Renew Kansas Biofuels Association Day at the Capitol, where we'll meet with the chair and leaders of the House and Senate and the governor, and speak to issues that are important to the biofuels industry in the state of Kansas, that being the ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and other renewable fuels in the state of Kansas. So today we have with us our board, the leaders of the various plants across the state of Kansas, and other board members. So thank you for your time this morning to introduce my members, and look forward to being around the Capitol today.
Thank you. We'll look forward to visiting with your group.
Thank you very much.
My appointed time, and then there will be others that have their appointed time, I'm certain as well. We do have several members that are online watching and viewing, and so if they do have questions, they can let our staff know, and we will recognize them. To begin with, we will have a presentation from DWR, Dam Safety, an audit report. But before we have that presentation, I'm going to recognize from the Kansas Department of Agriculture, the chief engineer, or a chief engineer, Mr. Earl Lewis, for the Division of Water. Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Appreciate you letting us talk to you this morning and being flexible, moving us up in the agenda so we can get to House Water here yet this morning as well. As you said, we're going to talk about our dam safety program, and just to give you a little bit of context, the state of Kansas has had a dam safety program for almost 100 years now. That is housed within the Department of Agriculture's Division of Water Resources. Terry Medley is with me today. He is our Water Structures Program Manager that oversees that effort for us. A couple of years ago, we recognized that it might be time to kind of look at this program holistically. Again, it has been a number of years since we've looked at it to make sure it's operating correctly with national standards and making sure we're serving the public well. And so the legislature appropriated some money for us to hire some outside help to look at the program. We've done that. We put that out for an RFP and had a number of people that suggested that they could help us out. We selected one that we thought was both good value and had some good experience. And Joe File with Benish is going to give you an update today on what their findings are. One of the key things I think is we provided the questions that we wanted to have answered up front. We had an initial meeting with them, but we said we don't want to tell you what you do. We want you to take a look at this and then come back to us with the findings. So these are their findings, and we'll have a bill introduction later that kind of follows on some of these recommendations. And I'm certainly happy to answer questions at the appropriate time, Mr. Chairman. But if it's okay with you, I'd rather turn that over to Mr. File and let him give you the results of their work.
Appreciate that, Mr. Lewis. We could ask you a lot of questions right now, but
I'm sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, certainly. Welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that was provided. Is that something that will be brought up?
We'll work on getting that brought up. Is that something, staff, that we do have? Okay. Go ahead and get started, and they'll hopefully get your PowerPoint up soon.
All right, perfect. So my name is Joe File. I'm a consultant with Benish. Pretty much spent my career in water resources, heavily involved in dams, dam safety, levee safety. And so, as Mr. Lewis said, we were contracted to evaluate the Division of Water Resources Dam Safety Program. Within that, they asked a number of questions as part of their RFQ, anything to look at, do they regulate the appropriate size of dam, to look at how they conduct, how dam safety inspections are completed within the state of Kansas, to some pretty specific questions with respect to just how they operate. In addition to that, we were asked to look at staffing levels. We were asked to look at some funding, and so we took a pretty comprehensive look at the program. And I think what I'm going to do is grab a copy of this. So on your first slide, again, the areas that we were asked to look at were the dam permitting and approval process, the dam inspection process. We were asked to look how DWR integrates risk into their dam safety program, compliance and enforcement mechanisms, some specific functionality of the Watershed District Act, which is a separate statute than the rest of the regulatory process for dams, and some other programmatic challenges. So how we did this is we conducted some pretty extensive interviews with Kansas staff. Perfect, and we'll go to the next slide. We conducted some pretty extensive interviews with program staff. Again, as Earl said, we did not base any of our findings on conversations or discussions with what they thought the direction of the program should go, but rather we just needed to establish kind of the baseline for what the program was. For there, we did a crosswalk and we interviewed approximately 20 states. A number of those states are listed in your handout. And so we spent, 1 to 2 hours talking with each of these states about how their programs function. We asked questions about what size of dams do they regulate, what does their inspection process look like, what types of fees do they charge for applications, what types of fees do they charge for inspections, and a whole host of specific criteria associated with their programs. We also looked at a number of industry standards, including the Association of State Dam Safety Officials, who's kind of the national association that puts out a lot of information and policy recommendations for dams. We looked at federal agencies such as NRCS, which as a federal agency, they have for years and years and years constructed a number of small to mid-sized earthen dams, very applicable in the state of Kansas, as we have over 1,000 dams that are very similar to that within the watershed program. Also looked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife and also some U.S. Army Corps of Engineer criteria. Our role was to provide recommendations on changes that could increase efficiency to the program. So maybe there are things that we could find that would just increase efficiencies to how things are currently being done. Also increase the effectiveness. Again, we were asked to evaluate the necessary staffing levels to carry out current operations as well as any recommendations we made for changes to those operations. We were asked to look at salaries. I'm not going to spend any time on that today, but that was a component of our report. Again, I just want to point out the involvement of the staff was limited to these interviews and updates. We did not really consult with or put together a working group with DWR to integrate their thought process into this. This was intended to be a completely independent review. And so finally, we submitted a report that made recommendations to improve the dam safety program and better align it with program and industry norms. So what I'm going to do today is just talk about a few of our recommendations that really would require some legislative action or legislative coordination. I'm not going to go into all of the other recommendations that they can implement on their own. We've had hours and hours of conversations with respect to our report once it was completed. So what I want to focus on today is just those actions that require some type of legislative action. Before I get started, I want to talk about just a couple of concepts that I think are important when I go through it. The first one is hazard classification or hazard class potential. When I talk about low hazard classification potential or high hazard class potential, I want to point out that I am not talking about the likelihood of failure or the probability of failure of a dam. I'm only talking about the consequence. So when we talk about hazard classification, we're talking about the consequence of failure. If it's low hazard, typically there are things downstream like agricultural dams, low volume roads, the types of things that it's pretty unlikely that there would be huge financial losses or loss of life if the dam were to fail, no matter how likely or unlikely that would be. High hazard class potential just means that downstream there are numerous homes, businesses, commercial industrial facilities, public utilities that would have a significant impact on the public. But again, it's not a classification of the likelihood of the dam failure. It's only a classification of the consequence. So I think that's important. And then the second thing, as we talk about risk, and I will talk about risk-informed decision making, risk is a classification of the consequence coupled with the probability of failure. So if you've got a high probability and a high probability of failure but a low consequence, then you've probably got a medium risk. If you've got a high probability of failure and a high consequence of failure, then you've got a very high risk because the likelihood is probable and the consequence is high. So in that case, you would have a high risk. Obviously, if you have a low probability of failure and low consequences, and you have very, very low risk associated with dam. So I just wanted to get those two terms out there as I go through that because I am going to be using those two terms quite a bit in this presentation. So the next thing I want to talk about is just a few definitions. This is something that we were asked to focus on. The first thing is the definition of a regulated dam in Kansas. The lines on in this table, the black line represents the National Dam Safety Model Law. It's what ASDSO recommends that the states follow, and the vast majority of states are doing this or something more restrictive. So any dam that is over 25 feet in height and over 15 acre-feet of storage is recommended to be regulated by ASDSO. Also, any dam that is more than 6 feet in height and more than 50 acre-feet in storage is recommended to be regulated. 50 acre-feet, think of a body of water, 5 acres in surface area, 10 feet deep. So you got 10 foot of depth, you got 5 acres, that's 50 acre-feet. So that's what the model law recommends. The dashed blue line recommends what Kansas currently does. And so as you can see, it's almost identical to the model dam safety law. There is one little exception at the front end where you'll see that blue line go straight instead of goes up. There are essentially probably less than a handful of dams in Kansas. I can't think of one anywhere. We couldn't find one where you would have a dam that is more than 25 feet in height, but has less than 15 acre-feet in storage. It just, with our flat terrain in Kansas, it's just not likely that it exists. So because of that, essentially, the state of Kansas is following the model dam safety law. So that was a good thing. There are some other nuances, but not really important, and we didn't really recommend any changes associated with that. However, about 10 years ago, there was a permit. I'll use the term exemption, but basically what the statutory change said is any dam that is less than 125 acre-feet in storage and is less than 30 acre-feet in height, if it is a low-hazard dam, again, low consequence of failure, does not require prior approval of the chief engineer, and it does not require that plans be submitted for approval. Functionally, that's not an exemption. It's technically still regulated, the best we could tell by our review. However, what the end result is because it doesn't require prior approval, a lot of the engineering community is now designing to that threshold. And so they're designing dams that just fall under that. There is a registration process, and so a lot of people do submit to DWR to get registered as a dam that meets that threshold. But a lot of times the plans aren't developed by a licensed engineer. It's very hard and difficult and time consuming for them to go through and determine whether the dam meets that threshold. It's a lot of work for that registration process. It has taken out a lot of the engineering community, and it's really allowing people to go up and push up some pretty large dams. I mean, if you think about 125 acre feet of water, think about a body of water that's 10 acres and 12 and a half feet deep. I mean, that's a pretty significant body of water that doesn't require regulation. We can say that it's low hazard potential. The problem is this can be done anywhere, and with continued development, there's no guarantee that somebody doesn't come and build a home or a development downstream of these dams. So we're essentially losing track of these. So our recommendation was to remove the exemption because of that. And I will point out that statistically, there are a number of our dam failures that result in loss of life in the nation do fall within dams within this size category. So it's not like it doesn't happen. There are a number of examples out there. We recommended, there is the term unsafe dam in statute, but it doesn't really define what it means. Our recommendation was to develop a risk-based process, which I talked about. Again, looking at the true risk of the dam and tying that definition of unsafe to that risk-based process. We also recommended adding some flexibility for modifications to dams. Right now, if you want to replace a spillway pipe in a dam because it's corroded, you have to bring the entire dam up to compliance, which sounds like a good thing, but if the pipe is the immediate concern, and if everything else is so costly that the money's simply not there, we believe that there should be some flexibility within the regulations to allow for that decision of let's fix the worst thing first, let's lower the risk of the dam, let's deal with the other deficiencies later. Right now, the only way that can be done is by waiver of the chief engineer. So functionally what's happening is that the chief engineer is approving almost every single one of these. It really can't be delegated because we are having to issue waivers. They are having to issue waivers for that. And then finally, there are some non-safety related things that are in rules and regulations. Kansas dam safety rules and regulations compared to other states are some of the most detailed and where so much of what other states consider policy or guidelines are in regulation. And we're recommending pulling some of that non-safety based stuff out of there. So moving to the next slide. Let's see. Oh, just some quick stats. I mentioned before, Kansas, because of the ag exemption, doesn't necessarily follow the model law. Right now, 84% of the states are following the model law or are more restrictive. 18 states are basically following it, and 24 states have a higher criteria. So if that tells you kind of where Kansas is at in the process, I just wanted to throw that out there. So moving to inspections, currently DWR it's required that a consultant, that dam owners hire a consultant to do their inspections. If you look at the history of this, it's moved back and forth over the years. In the past, dam owners have there was a time when the agency did the inspections, then it was put on the dam owners, but the agency could do it for a fee. As it exists right now, if you have a high hazard dam, you're required to hire an engineer, have an inspection report done once every 3 years, significant hazard dams once every 5. The reports are pretty poor. There's a problem getting them in some cases. A lot of them are coming in late. And I'm not going to tell you, there are some good dam safety reports out there. There are some engineers that are doing a good job. But just as a broad-based statement, there are a lot of pretty poor reports that are coming in. One other thing we noted when talking to other states, and I think there's only one other state that does it this way, the rest of them do it in-house, is that because this is all done by the owner and submitted, it takes away any relationship building from the agency with the dam owners themselves, so they don't have those relationships established. In other states, when we talk about compliance and enforcement, they talk about the fact that these relationships are more critical than really other compliance and enforcement tools, and we don't have that in Kansas because there's simply not those relationships that are built because DWR staff aren't out on these dams. It's kind of done by a third-party consultant. There are some other recommendations in here to align with some standards. We're recommending that instead of just doing the same inspection every time, we go to a periodic process where we do routine inspections, and then every so often we do a comprehensive inspection. It's really just a change in let's get eyes on the dam several times over the course of a period of time, but every so often let's do a full-blown comprehensive inspection of the dam versus what's being done now. That's really just a shift in the industry. Right now, low-hazard dams are not inspected at all in Kansas. In the nation, the majority of states are doing low-hazard dam inspections. The main thing, and again, low hazard, it's just a consequence, but what's happening is, especially in counties with a lot of growth, you get a lot of development downstream of these dams, and what you find is a lot of these dams are no longer low hazard, but because there's no process to currently inspect low hazard dams, a lot of these dams that may now be higher consequence failure are not being inspected at all. So we're recommending a 10-year inspection process. I will say that a lot of our recommendations are less than the industry norm. ASDSO recommends low hazard dams be inspected once every 5 years. ASDSO recommends high hazard dams be inspected every year. We're sticking with a 3-year schedule. We tried to right size this for Kansas. We tried to be practical in terms of these changes have to be meaningful and specific, and we can't just go align everything to the federal law. So we tried to be pretty thoughtful as we went through this. We are recommending the addition of a 4th hazard classification for very low or minimal hazard dams. These would be dams where it's very unlikely that the consequence could ever change in the future because they might be constructed 1,000 feet upstream from a large receiving stream. Think of a dam upstream of the Kansas River, which once it hits the Kansas River floodplain, there's really never going to be anything there that it could impact. So the chances of that ever being elevating to a higher hazard classification potential are very limited. And then desktop screening for some dams. We are recommending some changes to fee structures. First, for the permit application process. Currently, it's a flat fee of $200. This doesn't even come close. It's orders of magnitudes away from the level of effort it takes to review dams. There are a number of states out there that actually tie their application fees for new construction and modifications to cost of the dam. In one case, there's a state that charges 3% of the construction costs for their application fees, and that same state last year had an application fee that was over $1 million associated with that. So, and I would say there are a number of states that do this but have a sliding scale. So what we're proposing, why it sounds like a significant adjustment from a $200 flat fee to $5,000 for high hazard dams, et cetera, it's still very minimal compared to most states, and also it still doesn't necessarily cover the costs of just reviewing these applications for compliance and going through the process. And then for inspections, we are recommending that the agency do the inspections, as I said. We are recommending a registration fee rather than an inspection fee. So if you have a high hazard dam, it would be a $1,500 annual fee. A lot of states do it this way. It seems to work pretty good. Significant hazard dams would be $1,000. What I will say is if you look at that over the course of a 3-year inspection or a 5-year, it's pretty close to what the consultants are currently charging. There are some outliers out there where DWR is getting some pretty poor reports, but the fees are pretty low, but they're resulting in some pretty poor reports. But I think these registration fees are consistent with what a lot of the consulting community is charging for these inspections, like maybe about $5,000 for a high hazard dam on a 3-year basis, which equates to a little over $1,500 a year. So we kind of saw this fee as just a shift. It really doesn't have, it has limited impact on the dam owner. It's just shifting kind of where that money goes and how it works. Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of this pretty quickly. Risk-informed decision-making. I think we have a lot of recommendations, some which may take some statutory changes, but a lot of what DWR can implement themselves tie the definition of unsafe dams to risk, as I mentioned earlier. So every time you go find a deficiency, that doesn't mean you have to go do an enforcement action, or you have to say that a dam is unsafe, or you have to do something. I mean, a dam can be deficient. It can not meet a regulation, but if that deficiency doesn't significantly change the risk compared to if they complied with it, maybe you just notify the owner and let it go. But if that deficiency makes the dam significantly more likelihood to fail, then at that point, the risk would be significantly changed. So we think by developing this risk-informed decision-making process, which a lot of states are doing, it helps to determine where enforcement should be applied, what the definition of an unsafe dam is. You can also look at it for additional inspection needs. If a dam is really high risk and it's non-compliant, maybe you go to an annual inspection. Likewise, maybe you can skip some of the detailed inspections if the risk is fairly low. Shifting to the Watershed District Act, and I said this is a separate law. I think the big takeaway from this is a lot of states that have had these watershed districts, now people are abandoning their posts. So you've got a lot of these local boards that they haven't filled positions. Some of these watershed districts are dissolved. In one state, the dams were being turned over to the landowners. They didn't want them. They were non-compliant. They were being asked to basically get dams to comply with some of their to address some of their deficiencies, and it was a real problem in some states. Kansas is still in pretty good shape. We've still got good active watershed districts for a lot of districts. We've still got board members, but there are less and less of the younger generation that are understanding this. The big thing beyond that is in statute right now, the chief engineer has a lot of responsibility, but it's not real clear what those responsibilities are. And right now, the act does not appear to have rule and regulation writing authority. So our single biggest recommendation was to get rule and regulation authority into the Watershed District Act. So some of these, some of the actions of the, or some of the evaluations of the chief engineer can be better defined within regulation. Moving on to compliance and enforcement, I think. Oh, staffing and funding. So I'm not going to spend much time on this. We currently, the dam safety program has 4.5 FTEs that are filled. There were, I believe a year ago, 3 additional positions that were added, but the funding wasn't sufficient and they've remained open with very little applicants or interest, I think because of those salaries. We kind of addressed that in our report. But we did establish a baseline for what we believe it would take to administer the program as it runs today, which was about 7 FTEs. So with those unfilled positions, they're about there. When we made all of our changes, each one of those we assigned a staffing need to do. And some of those were actually some subtractions from some efficiencies we found as well. If every single recommendation that we made was implemented, then it would need 16.2 or 16 FTEs to essentially fully run the program. But the way we did this is there's a whole chart in our report that assigns to add, inspections, you might need 2.2 FTEs. To do the next thing, you might need 1 FTE. So we broke that down so that they could see what was necessary there. And so I guess I'm just pointing out that there is a lot of information on the report about what it takes to implement each one of these steps, and they've had full access to that. Finally, with respect to compliance and enforcement, the recommended staffing levels did include the addition of a dedicated attorney. Right now, the only enforcement mechanism that's really in the statute is you can write letters, but ultimately it has to go to the district court, so it's almost impossible to enforce anything. So we did recommend the addition of civil penalties as a tool to help. I would say the majority of states do have civil penalties. When talking with them, they think it's a valuable tool in their toolbox. It's not the be-all, end-all of enforcement. It doesn't work in every cases. When you talk to them, what really works is relationship building and building those relationships and educating dam owners about what's necessary. The civil penalties are a tool for them, but it's not the be-all, end-all. And most states that are really successful in this have some type of funding mechanism. And again, I talked about these big application fees, not something we're recommending in Kansas right now, but a lot of them are running a cost share program out of those fees where they can help dam owners repair some of the highest risk deficiencies with their dams. And those are the ones that are having the biggest impact. So that's kind of a future consideration. So going to the last slide, future considerations is something that I think needs to be thought about over the coming years, is consideration of establishing that funding because, again, states that are having the most success in terms of getting their highest risk deficiencies addressed within their dam safety programs are those that have the ability to offer some type of compensation with that. And then finally, we recommend doing another one of these reviews in 5 to 10 years to look and see how some of these changes are implemented. We've listed some things that should be looked at in the future that we didn't necessarily recommend now, but we know are going to become a future concern. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. This is a lot new to me, and I appreciate you bringing it. I have some real basic questions. As far as the dams go, who owns these? Are these are they basically private ones that come across here? How many dams do we have, and have we had any failures in Kansas? That's kind of what popped up at me at first. Thank you.
So I guess to your first question, owners range from private dam owners to homeowners associations in cities where homes are built around the dams to watershed districts own and operate a lot of these dams. There are a few state agencies that operate some dams. Municipalities have water supply dams. So it's a pretty good host of state to private and kind of municipalities, counties, and certain associations and everybody in between. With respect to the number of dams, and I'm going to look to Terry or Earl, but it depends on whether you look at this low hazard exemption or not. I'm going to just very much generalize these numbers, but I think we're in that 2,500 range if you don't count those ones that are exempt. And I think we're in that 6,000 range if you count all of the dams that are still regulated under the law, kind of per the model dam safety law. Are those numbers close? Okay. And with respect to failures, there have been a few. There have also been some controlled breaches. I don't know of a loss of life failure that's occurred in Kansas, but there definitely have been some failures that have occurred where there have been some uncontrolled releases of water. There have been some times when I know DWR staff over the years have spent nights in rainstorm monitoring with sheriff departments and others because dams were in active failure. And I also know that there have been some emergency funds used to do some controlled breaches at different times to address some deficiencies. So fortunately for us, we don't have those loss of life incidents. There were 2 states we talked to that wouldn't answer specific questions because they were dealing with loss of life incidents. One of them's an adjacent state to Kansas, and in both cases, they're relatively small dams that are close to the range of this exemption, this low hazard exemption that exists.
Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I got a lot of questions over 1,000 dams in Kansas. What's the average cost of a dam? I know you got different kinds, but
To construct?
to construct, just an estimate on that.
So that's there's so many different sizes. Maybe I'll take maybe I'll say the watershed, maybe I'll talk about the watershed program, a flood control program with watershed districts. So those dams today, I would say range from $1 million, $1.5 million to construct up to $3, $4, $5 million to construct. Now, there are some larger ones that would go over that, and potentially there are some smaller ones. Those numbers are certainly substantially higher than what we would have said 20 years ago, but I don't, is that a reasonable estimate of cost to Larry? I'm kind of looking to you. Okay.
Follow-up question?
Certainly.
How many new dams in the last 10 years been built in Kansas?
Very few. It's a very small number of new dams, and the reason for that, in large part, is over the last 10 to 15 to 20 years, environmental regulations have increased pretty significantly, and because of those environmental regulations, it has become a lot more difficult to build new dams. Now, I want to say this with a caveat: the number of dams that they're permitting, the new dams, probably something close to 10 dams a year. However, there are a substantial amount of dams that are being designed and or kind of conceived. I hesitate to say design because the engineering community is in large part out of it. There are a number of dams being constructed that fall under that exemption for low hazard dams, which is a pretty big concern because that's a much larger number. And so they get a lot more registrations for those dams that they review. And then there's no way to know how many of those dams aren't even coming in as registrations because that exemption exists within the statute. But still, I would say that the total number likely is, less than 50 dams a year for the new dams.
Go ahead.
So, however, with, like I said, 6,000 dams that meet the definition of the statute or the model dam safety law, a lot of those dams, I'd say maybe even the majority, have corrugated metal pipes. The design life on those is 30 to 50 years, sometimes even less, depending on the soils. And so there are a number of modifications to dams that are occurring, and that is a much, much more significant number and is expected to grow pretty substantially over time, as none of these dams have an unlimited design life, and a lot of them have already exceeded their design life and are in need of repair.
The audit report that you mentioned, how many pages is that?
The executive summary is 9. I think the total report is somewhere around 80 or 90. I'd have to look at the total number.
It's fairly significant.
Yes.
And the executive summary, is that something you could provide to the committee assistant?
Absolutely.
All right, we would appreciate that. Do you have another question? Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, sedimentation is a big factor on a lot of this stuff. Does that factor into your reports? We go out and spend $3.5 million on a new dam. What's the average life of the dam? And, In you doing your inspections, do you look at sedimentation at all?
To some extent, yes. The typical inspections are not going out and doing surveys, either bathymetric or up in the flood pool to determine sedimentation. So every inspection is not looking at that. It can eat into flood storage, which can decrease the way the dam functions. So it's something that you know, should be looked at periodically, either visually. I will say that NRCS, when they do assessments of watershed dams, they do look at sediment, and to be eligible for rehabilitation funding through their program, you do have to figure out a way to put that sediment storage back to and reset it to a new design standard or a new design life. A lot of times the way they're doing that is not by removing the sediment, because it's very costly and can have some contaminants and other things, but they're actually just raising elevations so that they're resetting storage by essentially creating more volume behind the dam.
Committee, it sounds like there will be legislation introduced, and I'm certain we'll have an opportunity to further discuss this at length. And because of the fact we have a committee hearing today, a bill hearing today, I'm going to go ahead and move on. Mr. Fowler, do appreciate you appearing before the committee, do appreciate your presentation. We'll look forward to the executive summary, and when legislation, if it does come before this committee, we may see you again.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, committee, we will move forward with our agenda, and we will open a hearing on Senate Bill 336, and to begin with, we will receive an overview of the legislation from our reviser.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Committee. The bill you have in front of you is Senate Bill 336, and this concerns underground storage tank operator permits. Currently, state law requires storage tank operators to obtain a permit annually. The bill has several changes, but all but one are technical, and that one substantive change in the bill would address the annual permit requirement for storage tank operators. If you have the bill in front of you, you can see that change on page 1. It starts at the end of line 20 and goes into line 21, and it really just strikes the phrase "and annual." This would still require operators to obtain a permit, just not on an annual basis, but instead on a schedule determined by the Department of Health and Environment. As I mentioned, all of the other changes you see in the bill are technical and would bring the statute in line with current drafting practices, the big one being that Kansas tries to use the directive word "shall" instead of "must." The bill would take effect on July 1 upon publication in the statute book, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Do we have questions of Revisor Lawrence? Seeing none, thank you very much. Our first conferee is with Fuel True, and that would be Mr. Brian Polser.
Hostler.
Okay, could I get you to pronounce that again? We may have misspelling on our agenda.
Yeah, my name is Brian Postler from
All right.
Fuel True, P-O-S-L-E-R.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I'm delighted to be with you this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senators, for indulging me to be able to come and speak before the committee. Fuel True Independent Energy and Convenience is the statewide nonprofit trade association in the state of Kansas. We work and represent and kind of serve as the voice for more than 2,000 retailers and distributors all across the state, a significant portion of which are our members. Now, this is my very first time to get to be a conferee in front of a committee, so thank you all for the opportunity to do that. I hope I'm back many times in the future to be able to speak about issues that are faced by our industry. But I also hope that every time I come before you, it is for a bill that is as easy and non-controversial as this. I'm not sure that will always be the case. But this will be a very small statutory change and will yield better outcomes for our industry, for KDHE, for the environment in the state. And so I certainly urge you all to consider to adopt this bill. Now, the specifics of this bill is that the current permitting process in our state for underground storage tanks is not really ideal for anyone. Currently, each tank, regardless of its age or whatever modern safety pieces are in place, has to be permitted every single year. There's a surge of applications that happens near the deadline every year, and that surge of applications for every tank coming into KDHE threatens to overwhelm the timing of how the agency can process those applications. That leads to some real potentially critical challenges for our industry, because it's absolutely crucial that every tank have a permit, because without permits, you cannot, without an active permit, you cannot have fuel delivered to your tank. And so that's crucial to the operation of any of these businesses, to be able to have a tank that is authorized to have people drop fuel. Because of the challenges of the permitting and the timing of the permits, we've actually had to have KDHE has extended the permit year each of the last 2 years, just because of their challenges that they have in terms of trying to accomplish all of the permitting in a timely way, given when the permits come in. So this bill removes the word annual from the statute. That will allow KDHE the flexibility to have a deliberate process where they change the rules and regulations and improve then the process. That's going to yield better outcomes for our tank owners, and certainly going to reduce the frustrations that some of our members have in that regard, because of that pinch point. Pardon me. It's also going to allow KDHE to focus a little bit less of its annual resources on the permitting process, and allow them to focus more of their energies on the much more vitally important compliance process, to figure out what tanks are in danger of potential problems and to go and work with tank owners on those tanks. It also is revenue neutral. It's going to ensure that all essential inspections and tank monitoring will continue unabated. We're a highly regulated industry with lots of rules and regulations. That's for a good reason. Releases from these tanks could potentially be devastating, not only for the property owner, but for nearby properties. And so this does nothing to change the safety mechanisms that are in place to continue our good track record of stopping, preventing releases from occurring in our state. So we really appreciate that KDHE has been so wonderful to work with in this process. You're going to hear from them in a minute about why they think it's also a good idea. And so, with the regulated industry and the regulators all seeing the benefits of moving to a potential multi-year permit process, my hope is that the legislature will allow us to move forward in that direction and to authorize KDHE to enter into this new rulemaking process. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that you would like.
You mentioned that you do have to have a permit to receive a delivery. Are you aware of any times in the past where there was no delivery carried out because there was no permit?
So we had a lot of angst this year until right at the end, the KDHE did go ahead and extend all permits. And so that kind of stopped those adverse outcomes from occurring this year. But we shouldn't have to rely on that kind of a stopgap change in the rule process just to make sure that we can, have government function appropriately and the regulatory process move the way it's supposed to work.
Senator Reichman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for your presentation. You mentioned that there's a little over 2,000 USD facilities and over 5,000 individual tanks. My question is, what do we have storage in these tanks? What are some examples of things in the storage? And do we have a record of how much leakage we have from those facilities now? Thank you.
Yeah, we do. It's mostly fuel tanks. That's what we're really talking about. Underground tanks at every gas station. We have above ground tanks. If you go to the car dealership, they're going to have a tank on site that they use to fuel up the cars. So our distributors take the fuel from the pipeline, pick it up, and they take it and deliver it to all the different installations, and they all store the fuel in tanks. So that's primarily the what's in the tanks that we're talking about. In terms of releases, we've had a really good track record. One of the things that Fuel True also does is we help provide third-party liability insurance for tank owners. That guards against any harms that would come from a release that would endanger some neighboring property, things like that. And I just learned it's been multiple years since there's been any claim in those third-party liability. And so what releases that have been incredibly minor, and we have an outstanding tank record here in the state of Kansas.
Seeing no further questions, we appreciate you testifying, appearing before the committee. You'll always remember your first time.
Thank you, Mr.
And trust that we were gentle on your first time through. Thank you. Our next conferee is Ms. Katie Gleason from the Department of KDHE. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Peck and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you all on this bill. My name is Kate Gleason. I've been with the agency for a while, but I've just started a new role a few months ago as the Deputy Director of Environment, and right now I'm the acting chief for the Bureau of Environmental Remediation, so I'm testifying here today in that role. KDHE supports this bill from Fuel True. It gives our program a lot of flexibility in how we, execute our permitting program. Currently, we operate under the statute. There's a set of regulations that have a very rigid and stringent permitting process. We agree with everything Mr. Posler said. All of the underground storage tanks submit their permit applications the same time every year, and all of the above ground storage tanks have a different time, but they all submit, at their designated time each year. And so it's a very rigid thing where our staff will get 2,000 permit applications at one time. That doesn't make the most sense, right, for how you would structure what your staff is doing. So in anticipation of this bill, we've already undertaken work to look at those regs, how they could be amended in conjunction with our stakeholders. So we're examining the state and federal requirements and standards for storage tanks to ensure that we, are equally protective of human health and the environment, but that we structure the permitting process in a way that makes more sense both for the regulated community and for the KDHE staff. And we just, I just want to emphasize we agree with Fuel True that this would benefit both the regulated community and the agency. So with that, I stand for questions.
Committee, any questions of Director Gleason? All right. Seeing none, you're getting off easy today. Appreciate you appearing before the committee. Committee, we had no other conferees as proponents. We had no opponents, and we have no neutral. With that, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 336, and we do have a question from Senator Francisco. Senator Francisco, you have the floor. Who's your question directed to?
My question is directed to probably both the reviser and KDHE, and I'm just wondering where the authorization for rules and regs regarding the training program would be.
We'll allow our reviser, Lawrence, to answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator, the Storage Tank Act does have a rules and regulations statute in it that is KSA 65-34-105. I am not entirely familiar with that statute, so I would defer any additional comments to the department.
So we will have the department answer the question as well.
Yes. Is there a specific training program that you're referring to?
I would be referring to the training program that's identified in this bill.
I think we will have to have our attorneys look at that and get an answer back to you, because I'm not sure.
I appreciate it very much.
Senator Francisco, is there a particular line you were looking at as far as the training?
It wasn't so much a line, but this is the part that talks about operators shall complete a training program. And I just wanted to make sure, because I serve on rules and regs, that those rules and regs do cover this training program requirements.
Okay, we will get a response back to you.
We would appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Francisco, is that the extent of your question?
That is.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you coming in online today. Committee, any additional questions before I officially close the hearing? Okay, with that, then no further questions. We will close the hearing on Senate Bill 336. There is nothing else on our agenda for the day. We trust tomorrow the weather will be a little more conducive so we can have a full committee room. As far as committee members, we are adjourned.